Good day or good evening, however we find you. Welcome to the 13th episode of Creation, Genesis, and Origins. My co-host Ken Miller is with me. I'm Dick Fisher. In 1928-29, Leonard Woolley excavated the ancient city of Ur in southern Mesopotamia. It had once been a thriving Sumerian port city situated on the Persian Gulf. The buildup of silt over centuries moved the coastline south, and now the long-abandoned ancient ruins lie many miles inland. In the hot desert sun and swirling dust, Woolley's grimy crews stabbed their spades time and again, digging deeper and deeper, filling their buckets with loose desert sand. The graves of the kings of Ur, Woolley called them, yielded their treasures of precious trinkets one by one. Cups and goblets, vases and jugs, lyres and harps, gold, bronze, and silver pieces of adornment and useful tools, such as this sledge, were excised from rooms lined by walls of stone. Grisly skeletons were wrested from their dark resting places and brought to searing sunlight. In the summer of 1929, toward the end of their season, Woolley's native digging crews made one last probe, a little deeper than the last plundered grave, to see what was in store for the following year. They found more pieces of artifacts, much to their pleasure, beneath the foundations of the lowest tomb. Encouraged by these finds, Woolley next wanted to know how far down they had to go before the treasure trove would end. Shafts were sunk carefully, sand and debris were brought up for close examination. Woolley had dated the lowest tomb to 2800 BC. Now, inch by inch and bucket by bucket, he was traveling back in time. Clay tablets started appearing among the loose debris. The inscriptions bore characters deemed to be even older than the previous finds. He had reached 3000 BC by his reckoning, and with appetites whetted afresh, still there was more to come. Shafts were sent down deeper still. At last the floor was reached. The journey had ended, and they stood at the bottom. Or so they thought. Then Woolley noticed the soil had changed from sand to clay. Upon close examination, Woolley determined that the clay had once been dissolved. What was water-laid clay doing in the middle of a desert beneath these tombs? His first thoughts were that the clay layer must have been set down when the Euphrates River overflowed its banks, sometime long before civilization had begun. Yet the elevation seemed too high for that. His next step was to measure the depth of the layer of clay. To his amazement, nearly 10 feet of clay was discovered before reaching another level of civilization beneath the clay layer. Once again, artifacts were brought to the surface for scrutiny. Another discovery was made. The bits and pieces of pottery were uneven, a sign that they were made by human hands alone, unaided by the potter's wheel. These painted potsherds were from a civilization even more primitive than the ones he had already uncovered, and later were identified as Ubaid. Mud bricks and even kiln-baked bricks were found at this level. Woolley reasoned that two dissimilar civilizations, separated by 10 feet of water-laid clay, could mean only one thing. An ecstatic Woolley reached a conclusion and sent a telegram that electrified the world of 1929. "We have found the flood," announced an ebullient Woolley. Elated by his find, Woolley encouraged excavators at other sites to look for flood layers. Sure enough, flood layers, or more cautiously, sterile stratum, of various thicknesses were found. At last, thought Woolley, archaeology had established firm evidence for what had long been a controversial Bible story, the Great Flood.
But that euphoric feeling was not to last. This chart lists the cities that were excavated, where flood deposits were found at the top with dates on the left. Dating archaeological digs in the absence of deposits of volcanic ash lacks the kind of precision archaeologists prefer, but nevertheless, using sedimentation rates, the thick flood stratum Woolley found at was placed at the early 4th millennium, about 3800 BC. Notwithstanding, a higher flood level was also uncovered, dated to about 2700 BC, but it was discounted as too little and too late.
Stephen Langdon and L.C. Waddelen excavated Kish in 1928-29. They dated the bottom layer, which amounted to about 1 foot in thickness, to 3300 BC. This seemed to lend support to Woolley's claim, even though the dates were 500 years apart. The thickest layer at Kish was at a higher level, however, and assigned a date somewhat closer to the thinner layer found at Max Mallowan, who excavated the more northern city of Nineveh, uncovered several strata of mud and riverine sand, totaling 6 feet in depth. Diplomatically, he called this not a flood, but a pluvial interval, and placed it at the 4th millennium, similarly dated to Woolley's lowest layer. But then flood deposits at Kish, Shuruppak, Uruk, and Lagash were considered, and a consensus put all these layers at nearly 1,000 years later than Woolley's renowned find, averaging around 2900 BC. This prompted a debate turning on who had uncovered the biblical flood, the most important flood in human history, and had left Woolley in a bit of a quandary. After all, he had wasted a lot of time and energy if his trumpeted flood deposit was from the wrong flood. As it turned out, the flood layer Woolley thought was from Noah's flood was dated too early in relation to the other sites, while the higher layer he had discounted, that was dated closer to the flood layers from the other sites, seemed puny by comparison. Ironically, the lower, earlier, and thicker layer Woolley thought was from the flood resulted apparently from merely a flood, and conversely, the higher layer and thinner layer he thought was from only a flood may have been left by the flood. Such is the life of an archaeologist who goes public a bit too early.
The importance of dating and the distribution of the flood deposits at the 6 city sites cannot be overlooked. Nineveh is the most northerly city, and according to Genesis, was not settled by Semites until Asher led the expedition in the post-flood era, Genesis 10:11 in the King James Version.